Hello everyone, welcome to the highlight show of Class Chess International. My name is Tatev Abrahamyan and I'm going to take you to the key moments of day 2. If you watch my other highlight show, then you must be familiar with the format of the tournament. So yesterday we had two exciting matches between Magnus Carlsen and Jeffrey Zhang and MVL and Wesley So. So today those players were taking a rest and we had two other matches with Fabiano Caruana versus Leinier Dominguez, and we also had Alexander Grischuk versus Levon Aronian. So at the end of the day, both Fabiano and Levon Aronian are leading over their opponents, and I will take you to the games and talk about exactly what happened in the day. So let's get started with the match between Fabiano Caruana and Leinier Dominguez. If you watched the first edition of Class Chess, then you saw that they actually played against each other in the first edition, and Fabiano Caruana completely destroyed his opponent. And Dominguez actually scored only one victory in the entire match, which must have been demoralizing, and the main culprit of the result was his poor time management. So in the game 1, Dominguez got his revenge, and he just got a crushing position out of the opening. So let's start on move 10. We had this Caro-Kann defense, and Dominguez goes d5, just crashing through the position, threatening to put a pawn on f6, asking this bishop where it's going, forcing his opponent to take, and now after e6, sacrificing another pawn temporarily, stopping his opponent from castling, knight e7, and now developing the pieces. Knight goes to g5, and the position is extremely unpleasant for black, and it actually was surprising that it lasted as long as it did. So after takes on g5, Dominguez decides to simply win the pawn back, brings his pieces into the game, and the material is equal, except we notice that there's a king on g6, so Yasser was joking, and say, bring all the pieces to the game, but it doesn't involve the king, but here we are. So knight g5, doubling the rooks, rook on the 7 rank, queen comes back pinning the rook. So there's actually another moment in the game that I want to take you to. Winning a pawn. So now we're going to see all the damage that this knight does to the position, threatening the pawn on g7, threatening to play rook b8 check. Really hard to deal with all these threats. So the king runs. So knight g5 carried this threat of queen e8. So rook b8 was played, but see if you can find a better move. Maybe you can pause the video. So this is kind of like a puzzle rush kind of tactic. You can simply take. And just collect everyone and eventually checkmate. Instead, rook b8 was played, but the position is so winning at this point, it doesn't really matter. So now he takes. The rook penetrates once again, takes again, and now it's game over because black is going to lose a lot of material. So that was game 1, and Dominguez started on a very good note by winning such a dominating fashion with the white pieces and defeating an opponent he had such a hard time with in the first edition of the same tournament. So let's go to the next game, and let's jump to move 37. So Fabiano now has the white pieces, and material is equal, but he does have a bishop for a knight, and he tries very hard to press for a win, f5. Rook on the 7 rank, giving up the pawn just to get this dominating bishop. So winning the pawn back. Because of this pin and this mating net, it's impossible to move this rook, of course. Bishop c7, but now Dominguez decides to go for this endgame of rook bishop versus rook, which theoretically is a draw with best play, but practically it's not so easy to do, and it's very easy to mess up both the defense and the offense. Like, you can find yourself in a winning position, but if you don't know how to win, you can very easily just mess it up. I will just take you to the ending of the game. So here simply white just starts taking these pawns. So there isn't as much commentary to do here. So of course we don't want to trade rooks. So he's going to zugzwang his opponent. So eventually we see this pawn is going to fall. So pawn fell. And king e6, which is very unfortunate. The commentators thought, well, actually Yasser thought that it was a mouse slip, and king d6 was the move that Fabiano meant to play, but now, unfortunately, after rook e2, which was played in the game, the bishop falls. So king d7, and the king versus king, and the game in the dinner draw. And so now the result is 1.5 to half in favor of Leinier. So let's go back to our next game where Fabiano has the black pieces one more time. And this was really the turning point in the tournament because something really tragic happened in this game in terms of chess. So on move 41, so we have this position where the material is equal and everything looks normal and looks like game is peering out to a draw. But Dominguez makes this careless mistake of just taking this pawn on e5. And this looks quite harmless. It looks like everything is just going to be traded and the game is going to end in a draw. But unfortunately, after rook e5, king f2, rook e2, bishop g4, we traded down to a last king and pawn endgame. So here he resigned because after take, and this is a very simple draw because black is just up a pawn, he will create a pass pawn and the king will run to the other side and collect everyone. So this was a very devastating loss for Dominguez, who had a leading score, and now the match is tied 1.5. So now let's take a look at game 4. So if we look at the position, looks quite pleasant for white. White has a rook on the 7th rank, has rooks controlling the only open file, the queen is active. It looks pleasant, maybe nothing directly, but if you had to choose a side, you probably would choose to be white in this position. So rook b1 was played, and here a big mistake was made, knight a5. So if we look at the position, it is the main weakness in white's position. This pawn doesn't look like it's going to survive. But after knight a5, now the knight can go to e5 because that's what knight on c4 was doing. It was controlling the e5 square. So now knight e5, and now black is left with this really atrocious pawn structure. And this pawn is also weak, and now we're going to see Fabiano's excellent technique. So knight g4 attacking the pawns, b6, because if the knight moves, these pawns are just going to fall one by one, because if you take a look at this knight, this is actually a very poorly placed piece. So for example, if you try rook b8, we can try rook a6, but even, let's say we go knight e3, asking how is black going to defend this pawn. So this move is impossible. And if rook d8, then rook a6, and asking where this knight is going. So it becomes very difficult for black to defend everything, because there are just too many weaknesses in the position. So instead b6 was played. And now Fabiano starts to collecting pawns. Defends everything. Winning a pawn. Winning another pawn. And rook e7, very nice tactical resource, as both his pieces were under attack, but he saves both of them. And after king e2, Dominguez just resigns because he's just down too much material, and it's hard to believe that black is going to hang on to all his pawns because there are just so many weaknesses, and once the king penetrates, once one of these pawns starts moving, the position is just going to fall apart. So Dominguez started with a 1-point lead, but now he fell a full point behind after losing 2 games in a row. So up next are the 2 clutch games where each win is worth 2 points and a draw is 1 point. So let's jump right into our first clutch game where Leinier Dominguez has the white pieces. So this was actually a Caro-Kann. So as we see, Fabiano's position didn't fall apart out of the opening as it did in the first game. So the position looks quite nice for black, even though he's down a pawn because his pieces are very active. This rook is very misplaced. And it's hard to believe that this pawn is just going to survive. So he plays king g2, which is kind of a strange move, putting the king on the light square when there's this weak diagonal. So queen a5. giving up the pawn. Knight c2, and we see that black is going to win an exchange, either by checking on e3 or by forcing white to take here, which he did, and the game ends very quickly. Takes, and queen c1. And here resigns because king e4 is mate, and this move actually runs into the very beautiful queen a1. And checkmate once again. So a really nice win by Fabiano Caruana, who now takes a 3-point lead over his opponent, even though he started with a point less. So let's take a look at our final game of this match, where Fabiano Caruana has the white pieces. So we have this position where white is down a pawn, but again he has a bishop versus a knight, and he's trying very hard to press for a win, and he does have a big time advantage. So bishop goes to z6, eyeing this g7 pawn. And here Dominguez finds a very nice resource, goes king f5, bishop f8, as rook g7 would run into knight e4, but knight e4 anyways, because if not knight e4, let's say you make some kind of a move, then now rook g7 can be very dangerous, threatening mate. But now with the knight on e4, black is defending by threatening his own checkmate, so white has no choice but to make a draw. And tomorrow they are going to rest, and their match will resume on Tuesday. So the other match that we have was between Levon Aronian and Alexander Grischuk. So Levon Aronian also took a big lead over his opponent. So this was a very up and down match, a lot of back and forth, a lot of entertaining games, a lot of really instructive games. So we're going to take a look at every single one of them. So let's get started with the first one. Levon Aronian has the white pieces. So Levon was doing really well in this game with the white pieces, but at some point he starts to push too hard and things go wrong. So he plays rook c7, giving up the pawn. And to push this pawn, attack the pawn on f7. And after king e5, bishop d5, and now he blunders with this move. And the problem is, after take, rook c8, black just gives up the rook, and now black is just up way too many pawns. So he has a bishop and 3 pawns for rook, and we're going to see how this is just way too much material for white to cope with. And I will just show you the rest of the game. Again, this was just a matter of technique, and Grischuk handled it quite well. So now it's just pushing the pawns, and it's really hard to suggest big improvements for white because objectively white's position should just be lost. And it's going to become very difficult to cope with all these passed pawns, because even if rook can stop 2 pawns, black will create another passed pawn on the other side of the board. And so he chose to run with the king to the queen side, but had he left the rook on the queen side, then Grischuk simply would have created a passed pawn on the king side, distracting the king and running his own king to the queen side. So here he's just here he did the opposite. So he has a passed pawn here where his opponent has to be distracted by, and 2 of them on this side. And it's just impossible to stop all of these guys, because rook cannot go to g8, this one starts to run, we will shoulder the king will go to f3, and this pawn will just run, because the king won't be able to get in on time. So a really nice game by Alexander Grischuk, bouncing back from a tough position and taking his opportunity as it presents itself. So now let's go back, let's go to our second game. Now Grischuk has the white pieces, and this game could have really ended in a disaster for Levon Aronian, but he found some good resources when he needed them and survived. So in this position, we see the weakness of this king, but there's a knight here, so kind of looks safe as there are no minor pieces to penetrate because this knight is blocked and there are no bishops. And this d5 pawn looks quite weak. So rook d4 was played, trying to trade queens, and now rook h7, a really nice blow in the position. And very unpleasant to face a move like this when you're offering a queen trade and it looks like this queen may not have an escape square because the f2 pawn is also hanging, so it feels like white is forced to trade queens here. Now queen f6, and now we see the unpleasantness of f7 hanging, so you cannot take. This guy is hanging, and besides having a really weak king, black is going to be down some material. So instead rook f8 was played. And here Grischuk made a critical error, which feels like a very natural move, and the alternative is kind of hard to find, I think, because that's less of a natural move and not where your mind goes. So he played knight e5, which was a mistake, and knight h4 would have been the winning move. So the threat is simple, it's to go knight f5. So to demonstrate, if I just pass the move for black, threatening mate. So let's say rook g8. And now we can do a very pretty checkmate. So after knight h4, kind of hard to suggest good moves for black because taking is impossible. And maybe rook c4 is a try. But after knight g6, if you try to take back, I will check and take, and once again this king, it's hard to believe this king is going to survive for a very long time. But luckily for Levon, knight e5 was played, so king goes back. This is defended. Rook g4 and queen c3, really great resource, pinning the queen, stopping any kind of knight g6 moves. So f4 defending the knight, takes the pawn. So Grischuk decides to sacrifice. So of course he can take a draw, but he decides to play on after a couple of repetitions. So he takes the rook and goes for down and exchange position, but with limited material and this king also a little bit vulnerable, black makes the draw quite comfortably here. I know it doesn't look comfortable because it looks so scary, but we are talking about the top players in the world. So rook it went back. So there's a lot of repetitions, so I don't need to focus on every single one of this. So eventually we go to this position, but now we have 2 versus 2. And if white starts pushing this pawn, then in turn he's going to weaken his king, inviting perpetuals. And white is pushing their pawns, black is pushing theirs, so the game petered out to a draw very quickly with a perpetual. So a nice escape by Levon Aronian, which could have been a 2-0 start, which is tough to start with 2 losses in a row. So let's jump to our third game, where Levon Aronian has the white pieces. The win equalized the match and put Levon back on the scoreboard. So let's jump rook e5, f6, and he decides to make very practical decision of sacrificing the exchange. Trading, and we see just in the long term and with little time on his clock, it's going to be very difficult to cope with the structure, and white is going to be winning a lot of material. So knight comes back, and now white is not even playing for the attack, it's just simply playing up material. So improving the king, pushing the pawn, putting a knight on an excellent square. The pawn on f5 was hanging. And a very beautiful checkmate. Didn't play until checkmate, but of course this is very aesthetically pleasing to deliver something like this on the board. Unfortunately it didn't happen, he resigned, but this would have been great. The next game ended in a draw. Grischuk was again in the driver's seat. He had some pretty good chances of winning, but things didn't really go his way. And this was the key position on on move 33. So he's up a pawn, he's pressing, and here he should have played h3 at some point, giving his king some room, trying like queen f2, queen g4, trying to harass this queen, exchange it, because the bishop is controlling this very important e2 square. Plays here, the king comes back, and now the queen gets to this good square of f5. So we got to this endgame, but unfortunately there isn't much to play for. And the main reason is the wrong color bishop. So we see Levon makes a draw quite easily by giving up this knight, and we know that because this is a light square bishop and this is the wrong corner, the game ends in a draw. So the next two games are pretty crazy games, very tumultuous, and some critical moments. If you want to work on your rook endgames, I would really advise you take a deep look into these games and really analyze them, and maybe practice with someone to really understand how to win rook endgames. Because we know notoriously it's very difficult to win them even if you're up material. One of the reasons is rooks are powerful pieces, so they get a lot of resources, and another is by the time you reach the end game, you don't have a lot of time on your clock, so it's very easy to make mistakes, as we see here. So in this position, so Levon is up a pawn, so he checks and goes back. So instead he should have just put his rook on the 4th rank, on the 4th rank, defending everyone, cutting this king off, and just bring wrong arrows. Just bring his king around to assist this pawn and eventually push this pawn. Instead, he decides that, the rule that we all know, that rooks belong behind passed pawns. So that's what he does. But in turn, his own king gets cut off. And now rook goes to the other side. Now that the rook is here to stop this pawn, black gets a lot of activity. And now it's impossible for white to make progress without giving up a pawn. So he tries, he pushes the pawn, but now the pawn is under attack. And what to do? The king cannot get in. So he decides to give up the pawn. And we reach this position. So white has the b pawn they're trying to queen, and black has the h pawn. So white starts to push their pawn, black pushes theirs, stopping this pawn and starting pushing their pawn. So check, push, a couple more checks here. And this should be a draw because there is no Lucena defense because of this pawn, so white doesn't have the chance to do that. And as the king runs, it will get checked. And here actually, Grischuk made a big error, but it wasn't taken advantage of. I think one of the reasons is because Levon didn't think there is anything to take advantage of in this position, because he probably thought it's just a draw. But he blunders with this move. And the reason this is a blunder, because now the king can run. Because the idea of the defense is to check, and as soon as my king leaves the pawn, you put your rook behind the pawn. Except here white has the opportunity of taking on h2, and now you cannot take because of this x-ray. And so black's best option is to take the rook and play this. So we didn't see this in this game, but don't worry, we will see this endgame in the next one. So we will see this position eventually. But this wasn't found in the game. Again, time trouble. So the king comes here to assist the pawn. So what black is going to do, he's going to give up the rook for this pawn. And because this pawn is so far advanced, the king will assist it with queening. And it will end up king versus king. So rook c7. King g3, take, and we have king versus king. So the match was tight now, but we have one more final game, and this was a clutch game which ended in a draw, and the next one is also the final game, the clutch game where a win is worth 2 points. So again, we have some kind of a rook endgame. One side is pushing their pawn, the other side is pushing their pawn. So g7, king e7. So instead here, white should really keep checking this king, because the king cannot really hide. Now we're threatening to take, distract the rook and queen, so this is going to be a very easy draw. Instead, he decides to play g8 queen, takes, and now c3. And now we're going to see there are some tricks in the position, because rook c8, and the problem is now if rook c3, king b2, and the rook cannot go anywhere to stop this pawn, so this actually just loses. So the pawn is untouchable, So king f7 is played. And now this king is just going to run away. So king f check king f3 and the rook came back. King f3 was a mistake, I should mention that. King d4 should have been played. And I will show you why king f3 was a mistake. So after king f3, rook e1, c2, king comes here, king f2, and now this last chance that Grischuk had to make a draw in this position. So instead of playing rook a1, he went to the other side of the board, and this would have been a draw because, let's say here, and now the king comes from the side. King e3 comes after this rook, and king d2, and you're just in time. So now you can take the pawn or just be fancy and make a draw like this. But instead rook h1 was played, and now unfortunately he is one move behind. So we enter this endgame, and this endgame goes on for a while. So I will just play through it, and I will show you one more key moment where it could have been won a little easier. So the king comes in. So you have to know how to win this endgame. It's not easy to win at all because there are some drawing chances, some stalemate positions that you can run into. So queen e5. And yeah, so in this position, there's an easier way to win. So instead of queen c7 check, queen g5 check is actually simply winning because the king just doesn't have a good square to go to. This runs into this. King e6 runs into the same thing. So king f8 runs into the same thing. This runs into the d8. And we're running out of moves, right? So this is the only option. And this is a zugzwang because actually this is just mate, right? Because if you go here, you get mated on b8. If you go here, you also get mated on b8. So very unfortunate. But instead, queen c7 was played. So there are some more adventures in this game. So actually, we're going to see the king runs all the way to the other side of the board. So harassing the rook, and eventually this rook does not survive. And we ended with a checkmate on the board. So Grischuk was very jaded after the game. It was actually really late for him. It was 1:30 for him, around 2 o'clock, and around 3 o'clock for Levon. So he didn't really want to talk a lot in this post-game interview. And Levon himself said that his games were below their level. He did joke that it's too late and he's not used to playing chess this late, but it wasn't really the excuse. Like, he didn't use that as an excuse. It's just something he pointed out. But he didn't seem too happy with the quality of the games, but he was quite happy to have won this game because he did realize that rook a1 was a draw. So as I mentioned, these 4 players are going to take a break tomorrow. So we're going to see the other matches that we saw in day 1. So Carlsen versus Zhang and MVL versus Wesley So. So thank you everyone for watching this highlight video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see these games in detail, then check out US Chess Champs and you can look through them, play through them and analyze them. Otherwise, make sure you're checking out the broadcast tomorrow starting at 1 p.m. Central.